foster care and unparalleled journey.
With Jason and Amanda Palmer. We like to talk about foster care and adoption and anything related. We tell stories about foster kids, bio kids, adoptive kids. We talk to caseworkers and anybody involved in the foster and adoptive system. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach us at fosteruj@gmail.com or check us out on our website at fostercarenation.com. Hey there, Foster Care Nation. Welcome back. This week, we've got a great episode for you. This week, I have to make an apology as well. I introduced our guest this week as Mr. Nick Sotelo. The truth is this is not Mr. Nick Sotelo. This is Dr. Nick Sotelo. Nick has been a counselor for over 20 years, and I've gotten to know him as a friend. So if it sounds like I'm not giving him the respect due, just know that he's a friend of mine, and that's why I forget to call him doctor all the time. Dr. Nick works with a youth correctional facility at the state of Oregon. He has a lot of great experience and a lot of great wisdom and answers to bring to us. He also has a podcast, and if you haven't heard it, you need to go over and bookmark that right now. It's called The Upgraded Life with Dr. Nick Sotelo. You can find him on Spotify and iTunes and anywhere else that you find your podcast. And if you're an iTunes user, be sure and go by and leave him a 5-star rating and review on his podcast, and leave one on our podcast as well. Now let's get to the show. Hi, and welcome back to Foster Care, an unparalleled journey, with Jason and no Amanda today. She's out running some errands that came up that had to be taken care of last minute, and so it's just me today. I am here with a friend of mine, Mr. Nick Sotelo. He has worked with the Oregon Youth Authority as a treatment services supervisor for the last 21 years. I met Nick in a dad's group that I'm a part of over at the Dad Edge Alliance, and I've known him for a while. He is a commander with the group, as well am I, actually. And we both have been involved. I've been in it for 4 years. I'm not real sure how long Nick has been in the group, but I know it's been probably about 2 years. So we kind of met over there, and I got on one of the call teams they have that had Nick on it and said, "Hey, I think this guy has a story to tell." Turns out I was wrong. He has several stories to tell. How you doing today, Nick?
I'm doing well, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, glad to have you. It was kind of an interesting chance meeting that we should meet up the way that we did and find out that there were so many different pieces of our lives that are actually in common there, especially around the foster care world. So, I mean, we can start all over the place here. You know, I know that you work with the Oregon Youth Authority, and you deal with a lot of kids who are in the justice system, obviously, and a large percentage of them come through the foster care system. The numbers of kids in care who end up dealing with law enforcement years later is a pretty significant number. Would you say you've seen that play out in your world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have the hard number, so to speak, from our agency. I could get it. I could tell you exactly how many kids that we currently have in care and custody that have a foster care background, but it's high. I mean, I would say it's at least 70% of the kids that come to us at state level corrections at some point in their life have had an out-of-home placement and or a foster care placement.
Why do you think that is? Because again, I don't want to feed into anything that any of the wildness that I've seen on the internet, because everything's a conspiracy once you get on Facebook. But the truth is just that happens.
Sure.
So why do you see in your experience? Because I know you deal with some mental health issues there, and you get to really dive into those lives pretty deeply. Why do you think that is? That seems to be such a integral piece of kids who end up in some sort of state correction.
Sure. And I'll try to answer that question in a couple different layers. And the first layer is what we know or what the criminologists tell us about the factors that seem to be common amongst people that wind up in corrections. So that's kind of where I'll start. So the question is, why do so many foster kids wind up in corrections? Both the first level would be what we call juvie. It's usually county level juvenile corrections. And then you have state level corrections when the juvenile department goes in front of a judge and says, we've exhausted the resources available to us in the city and county, and we're recommending a state level commitment. And then after that, if we aren't able to turn them around at state level youth corrections, and then a high percentage of adult inmates, adult offenders in Oregon, they call them adults in custody, also will have a foster care background. So where I want to start is just discussing what's known as the 8 criminogenic risk factors. And so this is what the criminologists have fed back to us. When somebody winds up in corrections, chances are they have a combination of these 8 risk factors. So I'm just going to list them out for you, Jason, if that works.
There we go. Go for it, man.
Okay. So they have, and just for folks that are watching or listening to this, my background also is in counseling and mental health, and I have a PhD in counseling. So I'm going to kind of interpret these things in the way that makes the most sense to me as a professional in the field. So the first criminogenic risk factor is labeled as antisocial personality or temperament. Now, this is where I'm going to qualify that is this is probably trauma. And I know that you just had a clinician on your show, Jason, that talked quite a bit about trauma and trauma-informed care. So if you have a traumatic background, if you've been physically abused or sexually abused, chances are that you're going to develop what in the mental health field we call a disorder, right? So that first one says antisocial personality or temperament. I'm going to tell you to disregard that label and just hear that this person has been abused and has trauma active in their psyche. Does that make sense, Jason?
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. And then because of that, the next one is called antisocial cognition. So the way that they think, right? So there's kind of your natural personality or temperament. And the next one is antisocial cognition. Again, so if you've been abused, you've been neglected, well, the way that you think about the world is going to be skewed, right? You're not going to see adults, in the case of children, you're not going to see adults as people that can be trusted, because the adults in their lives, for the most part, have proven otherwise. And then the next one is antisocial companions, right? And so, peer groups, who are these kids going to gravitate towards in their neighborhoods and in their schools and whatnot? Well, they're probably going to gravitate towards other kids like them. Is that their fault? Is that their willful choosing? I'm going to argue probably not. It's just what makes sense to them given their background and how they've been raised thus far. The next one is family stressors. And when you peel this one back, what you're going to find is these kids often have family members, people that are living in their house under their roof, whatever that looks like for them, that have gone to prison, right? That's what we're talking about here in terms of family stressor. So somebody that's attached to them in a caregiver role at some point in time themselves has been to prison. So they call those the big 4, that if you have those, those 4 things active in your life, chances are you're going to run into the system at some point. The remaining 4 are kind of the things that may or may not be part of a corrections kid's background, but we'll take a look at them. Substance abuse, not much going on in terms of education, not much interest. They don't see the value in school or a high school diploma. Same thing. They don't see themselves in a job or career. So there's kind of low motivation for those things. And then and this is kind of an interesting one, when you ask them how they use their free time, and they're less likely to identify like a pro-social way of using free time, meaning, playing team sports or being involved in 4-H or scouts or any of those things. They're not very likely to identify those types of things as how they use their free time, right? They're going to say things like hanging out, kicking it, and that type of a deal. So those are the 8 criminogenic risk factors that tend to be part of most any kid that finds their way to the correction side of things. And I would say that a lot of these things are active in foster care kids as well. So Jason, you have the background in foster care. When you heard those 8 things, what did those ring true, or what commonalities came up for you?
The truth is that we deal mostly with younger kids.
Yeah.
We've only had one teen come through our house, and that was just not a good fit. So we, that some of those are kind of harder to judge.
Sure.
But I find the pro-social idea really interesting, because I see some of that in a lot of kids that I know, some of my own older kids who have that as kind of the way that they see things. Hanging out with friends, just chilling and all that. That's right. Something that I see a lot of in my older kids. Of course, I think part of that's just the age and that generation, sure, and really being kind of disconnected with the direction they want to travel.
Right.
And so I find that really interesting. That's going to be something that'll be in my head for the rest of the day thinking about. Right. But the trauma piece, the abuse piece, whether it's physical, sexual, mental, or even abandonment pieces, I see that a lot on a lot of kids in foster care for sure. Right. That's super deep. I mean, the number of kids we've had who've come through who don't have one of those issues, whether physical abuse, sexual abuse, abandonment issues, or neglect, leading to those abandonment issues, it's probably pretty close to zero.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's across the board.
So the next layer. So those are the numbers. Those are the hard numbers in terms of what we can glean when we're looking at a kid's background, right? But yet there's kids like that don't make it to us, that have those risk factors, and for whatever reason, stay out of trouble, so to speak, or they don't get into enough trouble to maybe find their way to foster care. I mean. You don't have to get in trouble, obviously, to get foster care, right? But so the question is, what's the difference between kids that have these, same factors, yet some, don't penetrate into the system, whether it's foster care or corrections? And so I'm going to kind of give you my thoughts on that. That's less seated in any kind of data or research that you could get your hands on. So I think in societies, back to the beginning of time, that there's this need, unfortunately, to identify a group of people that are in and a group of people that are out. And you see that quite a bit, even in basic things. And I think, unfortunately, it's when you're looking at one kid versus the next kid, and you get that label foster child, well, then I automatically start spinning ideas and thoughts in people's heads, right? School teachers, police officers, a lot of people then start having these preconceived notions about who this kid is and what they're about. And are they really worth the investment? Because I think that's really what it's about. There's an organization here in my town in Salem, Oregon, called the Ike Box. And that's how they really kind of sum up what's going on with kids, is that when you have the space and the ability to invest in a child, then that child will then build upon that investment and return that back to their community. But when kids, for whatever, don't have the space and the people around them either choose not to invest in them, or they aren't capable of investing in them, that's when things go awry. And so that's the way that they talk about those kids as divested youth, because the label infers the solution, which is to invest in them. And the organization, again, is called the Ike Box, and the box kind of represents the space where we can start investing in kids. So they have lots of programs that are focused and dedicated to that. And they started that journey as foster parents. And so that I'll let them tell their story at some point, Jason. I won't steal their win, but they have an incredible story about their journey as foster parents and how they turned that into the Ike Box and are doing great things in the community. So I really like that idea. But again, back to my second kind of idea is, for some reason, society says these kids are worth our investment and these kids are not. Right. And the ones that are not are the ones that again, wind up in foster care. They wind up in juvenile, they wind up in state level corrections, and they wind up in prison. And I think some of that is based out of our human condition of wanting to, dissect people into the good ones and the bad ones.
That's an interesting theory because, you mentioned how people like to have those that are in and out, and all you have to do is spend about 5.5 seconds on Facebook.
Right.
And you can see that. I mean, it's this dichotomy of you have to be this or that. You're either Republican or a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
That's the simplest one. You're either pro-gun or anti-gun.
Mm-hmm.
You're either pro-life or pro-choice. You're either this or that. It seems to be a real struggle to have a third real option that involves a whole lot of thought process. But you see people really kind of consciously choose to pull themselves into dichotomous choices.
Right.
And I think that has to have a deep, well, I'm not the person to say it for sure, obviously, because my psychology degree expired a long time ago because I think I had child psych 101 in college 20 years ago. That's about all I got going on. Yeah. But I see that in just watching humans. That seems to be a huge piece of it. So that's interesting that kind of builds all the way into the world that we're talking about with kids in foster care.
Sure. And then I'm also a believer that, the internal vision that you have for yourself is what you ultimately attract to yourself in this world. So if you grew up, I'm thinking of probably one of the most heart-wrenching stories that I've come across in my career. And, I estimate that I've seen in the thousands of kids in my career in 21 years. I think that's a reasonable estimate. But so one of the most heart-wrenching stories is a young man who was born to a drug-addicted mom, and he was born way premature. And so he was in the NICU. And at about the 4-month mark, he had grown enough and stabilized enough that he could go home. And they had to call mom and track mom down to let her know that her baby boy was ready to come home. And so let that sink in. I mean, wow. I have 2 boys, and one was born a couple weeks early. And there was no way that you could have, ripped mom or dad away from that hospital or that hospital room. Right. Absolutely. And so this is how this young man was brought into this world, where he, other than the nurses there, he had no, contact with the people that brought him into this world. And so that's the way that, and by the way, here's a fast fact. If your first year of life is done well enough, then your resilience for the rest of your life is pretty stable. Okay. But if your first year of life isn't so well, then there's not a whole lot that can be done to boost your resilience categorically. Right. And that's kind of a shocking, statistic that we don't throw around quite a bit, because it's kind of daunting. Right. It's kind of in the realm of the versus childhood experiences survey that's out there as well. But your internal vision, right? So that's the way that you've been brought into this world. And then you have this messaging being pumped into you, right? Because when kids go to school as foster kids, everybody knows that, right? I mean, oh yeah, teachers know that, principals know that. If all of a sudden you show up and you're in the 3rd grade, where have you been? Kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade. So this messaging starts getting heaped on a young person, through their formative years of, I'm less than, I'm not like the other people, my parents, for whatever reason, didn't care about me, or whatever those things are. Then you start believing those messages, and that becomes your internal vision. And then because of that, that's what you start attracting to yourself, is this dark version of yourself that really didn't have anything to do with you. It had to do with the messages that people, put on you through the early phases of your life.
Wow. That's a little bit of a daunting thought right there in and of itself, because, we have a little guy with us right now whose first year of life is the horrifying stories of the world, right? His mom was addicted, well, still is to the best of my knowledge. She's kind of a halfway family member, and his first year was really difficult. And I mean, to the point where at 1 year old, he had already been in our house probably for a quarter of his life. She would call and we'd go pick him up, and he'd hang out with us, while she was out doing what she does. But when he finally came into state care, the judge ordered a drug screen, and they did a hair follicle test that goes back 3 months. And the list of things that he had been positive for were really high.
Wow.
I mean, I think it was weed, coke, heroin, meth, and oxys. And that was at one.
Wow.
And as you probably well know, a drug screen doesn't always catch that single use, right?
Right.
So there was enough in his system to make it into a hair follicle of each one of those. That's a terrifying thought.
Right. Yeah.
Especially for a kid at 1. And so, I know his first year was difficult, but, probably a quarter of it was spent with us. Probably just an interesting case study for a lot of people, but kind of a terrifying, number to look at and think that's his reality. That's a reality that we're stepping into with him.
Right.
So, yeah, that's an interesting story. I also want to talk, Nick, we talked a little bit in the past, and I know you had your own experience with a foster care system inside of your family to some extent.
Sure.
Do you care to talk about that a little bit?
Yep. So I think all things being considered, I was lucky to, I don't want to demonize the foster care system at all. But yeah, I was spared being placed into foster care because my grandparents at the time were able to take me in. I'm the oldest of all the kids amongst, my family and whatnot. So, my mom was a wild child. She, I think if I remember the story right, she ran away from home when she was like 16 or 17 years old. We were on the West Coast. I think maybe they were in California at the time, and she made it all the way to New York, and then made it all the way back to Colorado. And this would have been in the mid 70s, and got back to, like I said, the Midwest before she finally broke down and called home and needed help. And so,
wow.
Yeah. So she was the wild child. Lots of stories. And, my family of origin is those criminogenic risk factors, right? There's lots of those things that are present in our family. Adversive childhood experiences. When I take that for myself, I peg out in terms of high risk category. I went to go live with my grandparents. My mom went into the military, and that was kind of the last hope that she was going to go in the military. And then when she got out, she was going to take care of me. So she actually found her way to get discharged by getting married at the time, and got out of the military and didn't I think she tried to take me back. That didn't really work out all that well. And I would have been maybe one or two, something like that. And then my little brothers came along. So I'm born in 77. My next brother was born in 85, and my next brother was born in 90. And then I have another one that was born in 2000. So that's the spread that we are aware of in terms of progeny that are out there. So,
wow, that's quite the spread.
Yeah. So the other three brothers all, at some point in time, were placed in foster care. And some of that foster care was with my grandmother and my grandmother that raised me while I was finishing up college. And so that's kind of where my biological mom really kind of imploded for the last time and never really recovered, was during that phase. So when my middle brother was probably just going into junior high, and then my other little brother was, pretty young, 3 to 5 years old, 5 or 6 years old, something like that. So, but yeah, so both of those brothers on my mom's side have foster care experience. The one went all the way to juvenile corrections, and then the middle one, and then has been in and out of adult prison and adult psychiatric placements, in and out, on a regular basis. My younger little brother, he actually was the one when I was on your show, here in our area. He was one of the first cases that got elevated to what Oregon, or at least in Salem, they call it forever home model, right? And so instead of moving kids from home to home, they bought homes in various communities in our city, and then move care providers in when that need comes around. So the kids don't have to go to new schools, they don't have to get adjusted to new routes, new communities. They bring different care providers in when that need arises. So he was one of the first cases to get elevated into that scenario, and was on their board of directors after he aged out, 18, 19 years old. Joined the Guard and was deployed in northern Iraq, Purple Heart recipient, all that. But still, the things that he experienced, the abuse that he experienced, still dogs him to this day. He's been in a little bit of trouble this last year that forced him out of a career and whatnot. So he's still trying to figure things out. And I think a lot of that stems back to the early childhood experience that I was spared because I went to go live with my grandparents, that both of my other little brothers, definitely were impacted in a negative way based on the childhood that they were given.
We were talking earlier about all the numbers and the kids in care, and you see the struggles that your own brothers went through, and in the nurture versus nature conversation, I'm convinced that the true answer is yes, both, right?
Yeah.
Part of it has to do with where you come from, your biology. Part of it has to do with what you experience as a kid and as an adult, really both. So how would you say that it's possible for you to have that have a connection to the same entity? You're dealing with corrections, but from the other side, when you both kind of came from the same place, do you think that your connection with your grandparents and then being raised by your grandparents, a biological member of your family, really stepping in to take care of that for you as a young kid, did that really help you out a lot, do you think?
I've had to sift through that because of the training and the profession that I'm in, right? You can't be a counselor and without doing your own work. So I definitely have been forced multiple times to kind of sift through that and wrestle with it and come to some conclusions. So I definitely have that. I think it's a ever evolving project. But so yeah, nature versus nurture. Yes, the answer is yes. I think even within sibling systems, people are wired very differently, right? And so you can take, somebody actually did a study about this where they take famous people like Henry Ford, for example, had sisters and brothers, and they would recount things that he said, oh, this happened in our family or in my life or my childhood. And then they would talk to people that were either related to him sibling wise or close friends, and they would say that never happened. I don't know where that came from. That that absolutely didn't happen. And so I think there is something that is unique to every person, even within a family system. I mean, I think about my pastor at one point in time, who had an older brother, and one really is kind of estranged from his family and really blames that a lot on his father. And then my pastor friend really saw his father as doing the best that he could and had a lot of grace and forgiveness for his father, and therefore much closer to his parents. And so I think the individuals in the family, because of their wiring, can experience the exact same things and have very different conclusions of it, purely because of the genes that they were handed. So in my case, just because I went to go live with my grandparents didn't necessarily mean that I didn't experience some of the same things, right? Because it was my grandparents that were responsible for my mom as well. And so I definitely saw domestic violence. I saw, I used to tell people that I'm cut from the same cloth as a serial killer because of the psychological torture that I endured. And, I've seen Christmas tree full of lights going out the front door. I've seen Thanksgiving dinner go down the garbage disposal before anybody took a bite. I mean, I've seen some crazy things. Now, I wasn't necessarily physically abused. I can remember a couple times where maybe I got swatted on the face or the rear end. Again, I was born in 77, so these weren't things that would have automatically caught the attention of the authorities at the time. But
I was also born in 77, Nick, and I can agree with that. And my dad was a police officer.
Right. But I wasn't hit with objects. I wasn't whipped with a belt or those types of things. And my grandparents were obviously older. They were born in 32 and 34. And so I was thinking about that the other day. I think if my timeline is right, I'd be about my age now, maybe a little bit older, and taking in a newborn. So I was having that realization the other day, the situation that my grandparents were in. But I'm half Mexican, right? And so was grown up with a message that I'm a half-breed Mexican that's never going to be, amount to anything, and people are always going to be thinking that I'm stolen from them. And so that was kind of the messaging that was pumped into me in my formative years, that just until about 3 or 4 years ago, I don't think I completely uprooted out of my being. So, but yeah, definitely saw some crazy stuff in terms of domestic violence. And my grandfather was a powerful man. He held a position in federal government. He was a federal meat inspector, and you wouldn't think that wields much power, but it definitely does. When you can go into a meat plant and shut down operations right now just because you said so. And so he was a vindictive person. He was much bigger than me. Even, I'm only 5'10". He was, 6'2". And, I remember he used to, at the dinner table, he used to, his funny thing was to, quote the Bible, but then put his spin on it because he was God, So he would train me up. He would say, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he would point to me and he would say, I fear no evil. Then he'd point to me. And then I would say, because I'm the toughest son of a bitch in the valley. Right. So, and as funny as that might've been around the kitchen or the dinner table, that was really, his mantra for life. There was nobody tougher than him. And if you wanted to take your shot at it, then go right ahead. Right. And, that isn't always a bad thing, but it isn't always the most developmentally appropriate approach for things as well. So, but for whatever reason, I just kept moving forward, and my resiliency was intact enough, or I was blessed with it enough to not have some of those things impact me like they did my little brother. Now they saw other things. They saw, bio mom, filtering through boyfriends and husbands. And my mom was officially married 9 times, as far as I can track, myriad of boyfriends and drugs and parties and all that kind of stuff. So that's what they were exposed to, where I didn't get exposed to that side of it. So I'll pause there and let you reflect, Jason.
That's quite the story.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, as you mentioned that. I think a lot of pieces of that kind of mirror the story that my wife grew up with. So, I've seen from the spouse side some of those effects. And it's interesting that, in my wife's family, she grew up, I think her mom, she's on marriage 5 right now. But there was a lot of drugs, a lot of partying, a lot of that same sort of stuff that she grew up in. And when you look at her siblings, it's interesting that the split, that so many of them grew up with the idea that I will never be like that. I will never do to my kids what was done to me.
Right.
But there's one of the siblings who's currently struggling with substance abuse. And as long as I've known him, he's been struggling with some sort of substance abuse. And most recently, it's really elevated into some of the harder stuff. I think meth is the current issue, that, and it's caused all those same sorts of problems. And I can't quite figure out, I can't put my finger on the one thing that decides for a kid that I'm going to go against my history instead of I'm going to continue my history.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of those pieces I would love to figure out, because if you could teach that to a kid,
Right.
if you could instill that piece, and I don't know if that's the resilience. It's the closest thing I've come to, but I'm not real certain if that's it.
Yeah. And I've seen that a lot too, Jason, in my career, and actually, and it was representative within the three of us and, my brothers. So, when we parole a kid in our system, and oftentimes we're paroling them to a lower level of care, and oftentimes like a residential care or in foster care. If a kid runs from the program, more than half the time where they run to is home, right? They're running back to bio mom's house or bio dad's house, even when those homes were they experience their abuse, right, and their neglect, and so that's always a puzzling thing. Like, why would you go back to the place where those people abused you and neglected you, abandoned you, and whatnot? And this is where again I get to throw theory on there and give you my take on it, because I've thought about it quite a bit, and a lot of it just comes out of what I saw with my little brother. So if you take my middle brother, he got to see bio mom during a phase when things were actually pretty okay. So the family during this phase really kind of thought that our mom had, finally gotten on track, and things were going to be good. We wouldn't have to worry about her like we did prior to this. So meaning she was working for the post office, which was a pretty good job. She was working the overnight shift, and so she was home during the day for the boys. She was doing Cub Scouts with them. She was sewing Halloween costumes. She was baking and doing, she was kind of super momming it, and making up for maybe some lost time. And so my middle brother got to experience that. Now, most of that, so my youngest brother got to experience that from birth to about, like I said, 3 years. And then things really kind of went south. So my middle brother would always go home. He would always find his way to bio mom. My younger little brother, he really didn't want to have anything to do with her. Right. And I think, and that was kind of my deal as well. I didn't really know this lady. Like, yes, she was my bio mom, but we really didn't have much of those experiences that would bond mother to child. But my middle little brother did. Right. And so my theory there, kind of extrapolating from that to the kids that I see, is I think if kids saw, stable phases in a bio parent, that they hold on to this wish that that'll return, right? And so that's where the grace upon grace comes, oftentimes between a child and a bio parent where things have gone wrong, because I believe that they're clinging to this future of when mom and or dad, or mom and dad together, are going to get back on track, and then they can have the life that they once knew and experienced. Now, if you didn't have that exposure, or you didn't have that experience, then I think you're less likely to cling to that as ever being a possibility, right? And so maybe you just accept that way of life as what's normal. And that's another piece too. I think oftentimes kids will come into our system and get exposed to lots of different perspectives, and then they start thinking like, you mean this isn't normal? This what I experienced in my home isn't what all of you experienced? And so then things will start kind of unfolding for them. And we do see a lot of kids that will say, as much as I want to go home, I know that I can't. That environment just isn't good for me, and it hurts me, and I've got to be able to tell them that in a way that it doesn't do damage or limits the amount of damage. But we do see a lot of kids that not from a place of anger or spite or vengefulness, but just from a place of looking at it for what it is. I know that I can't go back there, right? And so we kind of help them through that process and help the families as well kind of accept that, when this person gets out, that they're going to go to independent living, or they're going to move to a different part of the state, and they're going to be enrolled in college and do these things. So that's what I see. That's kind of my theory and take on how some of those things unfold.
Wow, that's really interesting. You mentioned something a little bit earlier I did want to touch on too. You mentioned that there's a faith component in your life. Do you see that as being one of the things that helps kids get through their struggles? Because as you talked about that, again, it's interesting how much of that I've heard similar things from my own wife that really just bear out that story. And the faith component, though, how does that piece kind of fit into your life? And do you see that making a difference in the lives of kids that you deal with?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another one of those facts that's hard to dismiss, is that when you have kids that are involved in a faith tradition, the likelihood of them getting into trouble is significantly reduced compared to kids that don't have a faith tradition. And it doesn't have to be, any one religion, one organization. It's just what the numbers bear out, that if you are connected to a faith tradition, that's a protective factor. And so, again, so my grandparents were raised in the 30s, right? Or they're born in the 30s. They're just coming out of the Depression. And they were the type of people that went to church because, quote unquote, good people went to church. That makes sense. So we were the, I went through a long phase of going to church Sunday mornings. But again, like I said, my grandfather let us know who God was, and right, and he would bless us with his presence every day in his house and in him, right. And so there was a lot of mixed messaging for me around that. Like, I'm reading about and listening Sunday school, right, the felt board and all that kind of stuff growing up, but then I would get a very different take about who God was, and what the power of prayer really was. Like, if there was a God and if prayer worked, why do I endure these types of things? But for whatever reason, I kept going to church, and through my middle school era, church was a way for me to play basketball, organized basketball, and kind of organized basketball when the community opportunities were winding down. Church league basketball would kind of be in full force there. And so that's kind of one thing that kept me going. And then I went to Christian schools through this as well. Except for 1 year I went to public school. And so, I was immersed in church, in the Christian tradition. And I think because of that, I was exposed to, again, in my high school years, I didn't spend a whole lot of time at home. So my grandfather left us on Christmas Eve in my freshman year and never came back. And so I really didn't spend a ton of time at home. I was basically adopted by another family, spending as much time with them, dinners with them, vacations with them, and whatnot. And once I got my car, then I was kind of on my own and whatnot. But I would say, yeah, that, when I look back on things in my life where it could have went very different in a negative way, I really can't attribute that to anything that I consciously did. I attribute that to, the intervention from God and people that had to have been praying for me and whatnot, because it wasn't because that was the decision that I, thought was best. It just didn't ever unfold. And there's some things that, where when I came into work, as a fresh into the career, I was 21 years old, and I had 5 kids that were older than me because of the way our state works in Oregon. And just listening to the things that they were into and the things that they were doing were some of the same things that I was into and doing. And so it was kind of a wake up call that I could have easily been here, at McLaren, which is our youth correctional facility in Oregon, the biggest one. So, but yeah, faith did play a role for sure. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
how do you message that to a kid that, there's something bigger out there, whether that's, your religion of choice or some other form of spirituality? How do you get that message into a kid that to where they can understand that there's something bigger out there? And do you think that's the piece of that faith-based component that helps kids get to the place in their own head where they think there's a reason for them to go out and do the right thing?
Yeah. And it's consistency. And this is where action speaks louder than words. So you have to expose a kid like that to as many things as possible, because it's that repetition of exposure, that by the numbers something's going to click or catch. But this is where I'm talking about the investment model, where even if in a well-meaning system, we give 2 or 3 opportunities for investment, 2 or 3 exposure points, and if that doesn't click with the kid, then we throw up our hands and say, well, nothing's going to work for this kid. Well, I mean, you're dealing with a kid that needs to see it before they're going to believe it, right? And so you have to be prepared to do the long haul investment and exposure. So like in our system, our facility has almost 400 volunteers that are active, meaning that these are people that are coming in to spend time with these kids, and they're bringing in, their life experience. And I remember we had a guy who volunteered on my living unit way back when, and his thing was tying flies for fly fishing. Right. He came in and said, I'd like to show the boys how to tie flies. And I'm like, oh, good luck with that. These guys, but for whatever reason, there was 4 or 5 kids that just glommed onto that, and that's all they would talk about in between, and they would practice and whatnot, and they would just wait for this guy to come back in so he could look at their flies and improve their techniques. And these kids weren't able to go out and try them out, right? They were locked in a facility. And if you would have asked me back then in my younger years if I thought that was going to be effective, I was saying this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But now in my 21st year, I get what's going on there, right? Is that you never know what's going to work, and you just have to keep exposing. It's the repetition, and we're working ourselves out of a hole with the kids too. And this is for my staff. I try to paint that picture for them, right? If you have your normal kid and your normal family, right? Well, you're dealing with semi-flat ground, so to speak, right? Yeah, there's going to be some bumps in the road, and there's going to be some rocks, and you might find a pothole, right? But those are things that the typical family and system can help a kid overcome, right? But when you're dealing with a kid that's been in a system, and it's also the case, Jason, that by the time kids reach us, they've been in multiple foster homes, right? You're talking 5+. The highest I've heard is 33 different placements, right? By the time they came to us. Yeah. And so you're not dealing with flat ground, right? You're dealing with this kid's in a hole, right? And our job is to bring the kid out of the hole just to get back to flat ground, right? Because that's where the work can actually occur. But again, a kid's so far down in the hole, and he'll fight you, or she'll fight you. They'll fight you to stay in that hole, right? Because number one, they don't know what flat ground looks like, or number two, they've given up on it long ago, right? And so that's a hard lesson for people doing the work, at least on our, in the facility, to realize that, but the only thing that will get a kid out of that hole is that commitment, that repetition, that constant exposure to, like what you were saying, this world is bigger than this. You're only 16 years old, right? And this society will keep you alive till 80 years old. You're 16. You're going to be alive till you're 80, right? There's a lot of time to go for you to be relegated to this concept that you're always going to be in this hole. It just doesn't have to be, but you've got to show it to them. You can't just expect them to get there on their own. It has to be shown to them.
You mentioned a couple times the community involvement.
Yeah.
Having a family that kind of supported you as you were going through your teen years, and then people coming in and working with some of the kids in the youth facility there. And, I have a couple of friends of mine who one of them, my dad met professionally as a police officer. His mom called the police department and said, come do something with his child before I abuse him. And my my dad happened to be the cop who showed up that day, and he talked to him. And the thing was, he came from a hard place. You know, his dad wasn't involved. His dad had some issues, and my dad got a hold of him and got to talk to him and found out he liked hunting, he liked fishing. You know, we're here in the Midwest. That's kind of a popular thing. And my dad grew up doing those things, and I grew up doing those things with my dad. And he said, hey, you know, get your stuff together and I'll take you with me. And turns out that me and my buddy Josh, we grew up from, I'd had to think real hard, trying to remember how old I was when I met him. You know, we were probably about the 5th grade or so when I met him. And today I can take you right to his house. You know, he's now married. He has a good job. He actually became a police officer for a little while himself. And, you know, but he decided that wasn't the line of work he wanted to be in. And he's been in the construction trades for years. He has 3 kids of his own, 2 boys and a little girl, and his life is completely turned around. And I've seen the difference that I can trace back to that moment where he met my dad. Right. And I've got another friend of mine who we grew up across the street from, and I knew little Stevie from the time he was little Stevie, right? He doesn't answer to Stevie anymore. But, you know, him and his family moved out of state, and his parents had a divorce, and they had a lot of issues. I don't know all the details exactly, but I know that at a very young age, before he graduated high school at some point, he ended up out on the streets. He was running with a gang down there. He was, you know, using and selling and all that. And he showed back up he's probably about 18 when he showed back up at our house one day and said, hey, I got myself in some trouble down there. I'd like to try and turn my life around. And my dad took him into our house. And today, if you search his first and last name on Google, you will get a picture of him. He's somebody in his world of work. He's, you know, he's got a lot of things that he's done now. And, you know, most notably, he raises his own family, and he has his kids, a little boy and a little girl. And he's a great dad now, and completely changed his life around. And I think that you can look back at that and see that the successes they've had can be directly linked to a member of the community who reached out and said, hey, why don't you come over here? We're going to love on you a little bit. We're going to show you a few things. We're going to just treat you like a human. And the piece where the community, somebody in the community steps in and says, you're worthwhile. Yep. You know, that appears to be a big factor for success in the future. Would you agree with that? And why do you think that is? And is there a way that people who maybe you're not ready to be a foster parent, because a lot of people aren't, you know, quite frankly, most people aren't wired to do this. And some days I wonder if I am even. Right. But you know, at some point there's a piece of that can be so beneficial in a kid's life. And have you seen that play out in the people like yourself who've come out of hard places, who've managed to not continue to stay in that hard place and gotten themselves out of that hole you're talking about?
Absolutely. In our treatment world, we talk about one of our mantras is programs don't change people, people change people. And I think that's true no matter what the setting or situation is, that it's really the people that, again, chose to invest in us for whatever reason that make the difference. And that's also borne out in our research in corrections as well. So when we do get a kid in, we put them through a battery of assessments, and one of them is the risk needs assessment. And a risk factor in there is does the child outside of his family of origin have any positive connection to at least one adult? And if the kid answers, yes, I do have a positive connection to a non-family member adult, then that gets checked as a box of a protective factor. If the kid answers no, then a check goes in the box as a risk factor. So this takes one positive connection with an adult outside of the family of origin to check that protective factor box. And so for people who have a heart for these types of kids, there's lots of ways that you can help check that box as a protective factor. Be a reading buddy at school. get involved with, the organizations that are youth and kid oriented. Maybe you can't be a foster care parent, but can you do some respite care? I mean, can you come in and white knuckle through a day at a foster home so that the parents can do what they need to do, get away, get some time away. So there's lots of opportunities. Or, look at your youth correctional facilities that are potentially in your area, and can you volunteer there? Right. There's a lot of ways that you can take a little bit of action, a little bit of investment, a little bit of love for your fellow human beings, and make a huge impact. You're never going to know what you could do unless you get out there and try it. And it could be the one conversation, it could be the one activity, it could be the one you passing on wisdom that was passed down to you and your family that might click in that kid, and that's all it takes.
We talked with a gal, Rebecca Britt from Stable Moments a while back, and she has an equine therapy program that she's been running, and she's actually kind of franchising that out at the moment. And that was one of the things we talked about, is she's noticed that the equine therapy, where it's very helpful in a lot of ways, the horses don't seem to be necessary. And she's looking at exactly that idea right now, is finding ways to connect with a kid regardless of what they're connecting around. As long as you're connecting with the kid, I think that's a huge piece.
Yeah. And my theory there, Jason, and this is where I'm responsible for theory, because when people come around us, they want to know, what we're doing, what's our intervention based in. And so here's my best answer right now is I've always been a fan of attachment theory. So that's a whole discipline within the field of counseling and psychology. And, people like Eric Erickson kind of on Piaget were on the front end of breaking life development down into stages in attachment theory. But I won't go too deep into that. But here's what I think is happening, or what needs to happen. Basically, what attachment theory says, that people need secure attachment in order to have successful lives, right? And secure attachment comes from being able to have positively predictable parents. Meaning, when I'm hungry, I'm going to get fed. When I'm hurt, I'm going to get help. When I'm cold, somebody's going to help me get warm. Those types of things, and you can predict that in a positive way, right? So those are some of the building blocks for secure attachment. Now, it's pretty easy to tell that kids that wind up in foster care or kids that wind up in the juvenile justice system don't have secure attachment. And when you don't have secure attachment, then your outlook on yourself and the world is negative, right? I must not be worthy of being protected and helped and cared for. And I can't trust this world to do anything. I always got to be on guard. I always have to be vigilant. People are always out to get me and take advantage of me. And those are all, in my opinion, products of something other than secure attachment. And again, I won't get into the different other forms of attachment. So when we are investing in kids, as foster parents or formal systems in corrections, that's what I believe our goal is. Our goal is to create what's called earned secure attachment. And that's an anchor point in the literature that anybody can look up. It's not a huge body of work, because it's hard to measure, it's hard to quantify, and that's what gets traction, is things that you can measure and quantify. But that's what I believe is the mechanism that's at play for turning somebody's life around, is that you're helping them develop earned secure attachment. And it used to be that attachment used to be considered a finite thing. Either you were secure attached or you weren't, and there wasn't a whole lot that you can do about it. But we're finding out that isn't the case, but it's hard work. This is where I'm talking about the constant exposure, the constant, I'm here with you for the long haul. When I consult with residential treatment programs, and when I've built from the ground up some of our living units, I tell them, there's 2 points of magic when you're working with these types of kids, and here they are. Treat them like kids, versus treating them like, criminals, or treating them like whatever label you want to put on them. Treat them like kids, right? And by definition, kids learn through a process of trial and error, right? It doesn't matter who the kid is and what the setting is. Kids will learn through a process of trial and error, which means that they're going to do incredibly stupid things because they're kids and their brains aren't developed, right? So don't
Oh yeah.
ascribe to that anything other than just being a kid, and then don't give up on them, right? That's the second point of magic. If you can build a program, if you can recruit staff, if you can have leadership that buys into those two things, then you can start making a difference in kids' lives, right? Where oftentimes our systems are set up to label kids, right? And we start calling them antisocial, we start calling them criminal, we start calling them pathological. And then we look at all their behavior as evidence of those things rather than just being a kid that was really dumb in that moment. And then we say, we can only tolerate so much of this behavior before we're going to move you on to the next place, rather than once you're here, you're going to be here. And I get it. This is hard, right? I'm not saying this is easy. But then we just condition kids as we move them through the system. We reinforce the message, right? The kind of the dark internal vision. And we prove to them that people really don't care about them. And once they reach their limit, they're just going to move them on to the next system. So to loop that back around, the mechanism that I think it's at play is helping kids develop, earn, secure attachment. And then once you have that in place, then you see a lot of rapid growth. You see a lot of rapid change. And again, going back to our last little piece of the conversation, you just don't know when that's going to happen, right? So the constant exposure, getting them in front of people that have something to offer. It could be just one conversation, one trip to the beach, one hunting excursion, but you've got to be in it for the long haul and keep the repetition going.
Well, I want to touch on one other thing real quick. My 14-year-old son and I actually had a conversation last night, and it was interesting because my kids will always tell you, Dad, you're always trying to make a life lesson out of everything. And I go, I know, because it's life, and learn lessons from every piece of life, and you'll get some wisdom earlier in life, and you won't screw yourself up. But we were talking about character and having character, and how that's so important for future success. And kind of I have my own list of things that I try to instill in kids. There's some things that I think just for me make sense, that this is the most beneficial things that you can have. Simple things like the ability to be honest, so that you can build trust with people. I think that's important. And, the ability to take what you have in your life and reach out and help somebody else where you can. That's another thing that's important. You're putting yourself out there to change the world in a better way. And I think that helps that bigger than you mission become developed in your own mind. How would you say, or maybe the better question is, what character qualities do you see are that you can instill in a child that will best serve their future?
Sure. Yeah. And I built a skill building curriculum from the ground up. And so it's those things that I think are universal and needed, and that the kids that wind up with me in my care, they don't have, right? And so the curriculum is called Nexus, and it's got 4 components. So here it is. It's balance, believe, contribute, and excel. Those are the 4 components. And then in each of those components, there's distinct skill sets that are filed under there. So balance is that ability to handle stress in your life, right? And so you have to be able to understand yourself. You've got to know the things that have the potential that throw you for a loop, and you've got to have a plan for those things, right? So how do you know yourself, and then how do you plan to it's kind of basically how do you build up your own resilience, right? So that's balance. How do you make wise choices? And when your peer group is saying, let's do this thing, which for them may not be a big deal, but for you, maybe it is a big deal. Maybe it's a point of vulnerability. You've got to know yourself well enough to be able to make better choices or different choices. And that's all, taking care of your body as well. I think that's something that we don't do with kids we try in our health classes and whatnot, but it's not really modeled for them. Like, how do you take care of this physical organic thing that you really need to have in top shape? Otherwise you're vulnerable to a lot of things. So that's balance. Believe is what we just talked about for the most of this conversation, is how do you develop a positive self-concept? because if you don't have a positive self-concept, then you're just going to limit yourself, and you're going to not realize and reach your potential, which is the tagline for my program that I work with people, right? So you've got to have that positive self-concept. Contribute is this idea that everything that you say or do has the potential and the opportunity to make your immediate environment better or worse, right? And it's realizing that we are connected to bigger and bigger systems, whether we want to believe it or not. And we have that ability to impact our environment with our words and our actions, right? And so, and we need that mutual help. So it's valuing the connection with other people. I used to, when Obama said, "Hey, you didn't build that," I didn't believe it. And I actually thought that was, I took great offense to that when he said that. And then, the several years kind of in my own personal development growth, I've recognized, yeah, it's true, right? I mean, nobody gets anywhere in this life without either somebody paving that path before us, or somebody investing in us, somebody giving us advice, or so valuing connection with other people, I think, is a huge lesson. And especially for kids that wind up in foster care, right? Because part of their survival and their resilience is, I don't need other people, right? It's just me against the world. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if it's your only outlook on life, it's going to run its course, and you're going to find yourself in a scenario where you need help, but you won't ask for it because you have this belief of, I don't need anybody. It's me against the world. And then excel is the fourth component. Is you've got to be constantly challenging yourself. You have to embrace that life is a process of learning by failure. And so when you have those failure points, you have a choice. You can declare defeat and give up, or you can step back from it, take your lumps, see what went right and what went wrong, and learn from it and commit to moving forward. So that's that excel part, that you can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't put it into action and don't take steps, you're not really doing anything for yourself. So that's what I would say. And that's the curriculum that I built from the ground up. And, I love it when the staff that are delivering the curriculum say, "This really helped me too." I'm like, yeah, it's not just for criminals. It's not just for foster care kids. It's for everybody. This is what I really believe. If you have those four things dialed in, you're going to be doing some great things with your life.
Nick, what I heard was learning how to handle your stress, developing a positive self-image, valuing the connections around you,
Yep.
and challenging yourself to be better.
Perfect.
If I look at that, and I look at the people around me, the people I know, I bet you it's a pretty small percentage of the people that I know that do that well, even adults. That's got to be a challenge trying to instill that in kids who've had a real negative beginning.
Yep. That's what you got to show it. And that's what I tell my staff that are doing it. Like, if I could wave a magic wand with anybody that's working with kids, they would have those four things dialed in, and especially the Excel piece, because what I tell my staff is, when we get a kid that finds their way, and it takes this in Oregon, it takes quite a bit to come to facility side corrections, right? It's almost like somebody getting a cancer diagnosis. And so a lot of people can kind of relate to that. And the numbers are that we're not very far removed from somebody who has cancer. And what I mean by that is, when you get that cancer diagnosis, your doctor is going to ask you to do wholesale life change, right? If you've got to do something drastically different with your diet, you've got to be dedicated to doing these treatments, you've got to be taking these medications, right? You may have to do a career shift, whatever that is, right? A cancer patient is being asked to do wholesale life change. Well, it's the same thing with these kids when they've been brought in and they come into the system, right? We're telling them to start liking school, which most of them hate school. Start liking school. Stop hanging out with these people. Stop doing drugs, right? Wholesale life change. But if the staff that are delivering the message don't like school, they're doing drugs or those things, they're phonies, they're imposters. And the kids can smell that from a million miles away. And I think that's a big part of what makes some of these interventions and programs not as effective as they could be is it really is dependent on the person delivering the message, right? So you're right. There's probably a way too small of a pool to pull from. But that's why in my kind of later phase of my career, I'm really more jazzed about investing in the staff, because I know that they're going to be the message carriers, right? So if I can get them to be looking at their own lives and embracing those 4 concepts and really pushing themselves, then when they ask the kids or put it in front of the kids to make wholesale life change, it'll be way more genuine, right? A kid will say, okay, if you're doing it, I'm gonna give it a shot as well. So you're right, it's a small pool to pull from for sure.
Well, that's something I find interesting, with our own kids, with our 14-year-old and my 12-year-old, especially because they're in that age where fair is a big thing, and you're right, they can smell phony from a mile away. And integrity is something that I think is unfortunately really harder to find in today's culture. But we've had those conversations where, somebody mentioned that, oh, well, they smoke weed, but it's for their diabetes. And I went, hang on. Hang on.
Yeah.
Weed for diabetes doesn't make any sense to me. It's going to give you the munchies, and then you're going to eat probably something really unhealthy, which is going to be really bad for your diabetes.
Right.
And the thing is it was a family member who they have some real connection with. And so it's really easy for them to believe that. And my words have zero effect unless I can look you in the eye and say, look, bud, I am the guy who always tells you the truth. I am the guy who will tell you you're ugly and your mama dresses you funny if you're ugly and your mama dresses you funny, right? Like, I will tell you the truth even when it hurts, because it's the best thing for you. And without having that integrity in the relationship first, nothing I say can make a bit of change.
Right.
And that's been a lesson that I've had to really learn with the kids, through experience and over time, because man, they won't hear you if they don't believe you.
They're in that hole, right? They've never been able to trust and believe adults. Or why are they going to trust Jason just because he says, just because he says so, right? They have to experience it. They've got to see it.
Yeah. And it's been that long-term experience that we've had where I've been always, and this probably goes back to my childhood, and, because I was raised in kind of in a church that believed that every mistake you made would send you immediately to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of probably a fear-based thing. One of the few fear-based things that turned out positive for me in my life is that I believed that, 100% honesty and integrity was something that you had to have if you wanted to keep yourself out of hell. Mm-hmm. And I built that as a young kid. And so today, like, if I have something to say, it's not going to be a lie, and people know that. I do some training with my work, and I had one particular guy who I trained for a while, and he just wasn't working out. He had some issues, and he didn't want to be there. And when I told the boss, I said, look, I'm done with this one. Sorry, but I can't do anything more. We're not going anywhere. And they called him in to let him go. And the first words out of his mouth was, because he was a younger black guy. And he says, well, Jason's racist. And, that can be a big thing, right? That could be dangerous in any corporate setting, in any kind of company. But the boss immediately laughed, because they know me. They know me well, and they know that the level of my honesty and integrity. And they also happen to know that we're a foster family, that, I don't fit any real racial profile. Number one, I'd have a hard time being racist against somebody, because I pick out the character qualities in my face, and you'll find 5 different races there maybe. And our family also is so dang colorful, and they know that. They've seen that over time. And they know who I am at heart, and they believe in the integrity of who I am. And if they ask me a question, I'll tell them the truth. I'm not going to lie to save my own skin. I mean, that's the worst thing you can do, is because once you build that, people believe that about you. Right. And that's something I try so hard to build in kids, is that honesty and integrity piece, because I don't think without having that as your foundation, I don't know if any of the rest of it will really matter, because the kids just won't hear it. Yeah. That's been a strong thing in my life.
Absolutely. And I think it's also a process, honesty, integrity is, values that are obviously important to you, and they've served you well. And I think it's also, we need to have a process ready to go for these kids to help them find and discover the values that are most meaningful for them as well. So I don't think you can start too young with doing a values clarification process with people. It's my belief that those, I think we're born into this world with an innate sense of justice, right? And that comes from a theory of family counseling, right? That we're born in this world with an innate sense of justice, and that's why we recognize those violations against us, right? Because if that wasn't imprinted on our soul and being, just by nature of being born into this world, then we wouldn't necessarily have the reaction to abuse and neglect, right? So we come into this world with an innate sense of justice, and I think that there's probably values that are unique to everybody, and so being able to help a young person through values clarification, I think is pivotal.
Wow. Well, I appreciate your time here today, Nick. Yeah. I know I've taken up a lot of it. Real quick, one last question I like to ask people is, and you come from a really unique place as somebody who not only went through some trauma and struggles as a young person, somebody who found his way out of that and now helps kids who found their way into that problem place. You've seen a lot of different sides of this situation. What's one piece of advice that you can give? What's one piece of wisdom that's hard for anybody else to be able to have grabbed a hold of, and that you could share with the listeners to help them either in their own lives or raising their kids and foster kids and adoptive kids and reach out to them and really make a difference in the way they see their world?
Wow, that's a big question. I definitely could go a lot of different directions, but what's coming up in me right now would be that I really believe that regardless of the hand that's been dealt to you, I mean, we all get dealt a different hand. There is somebody who is like you that has made it, right? That has made it out, that has a path. And I want people to know that if one person can make it, you can make it as well. But what it's going to take is for you to believe that about yourself and to ask others for help. I think those are the two things, right? That everybody gets dealt a hand. Some hands are better off than others, but I guarantee you there is somebody that had a similar hand as you that has made it, that has created the life that they wanted for themselves, that has overcome all the hurdles and obstacles. And if they can do it, so can you. You just have to believe it, and you've got to be willing to ask for help to get there.
That's great. Yeah, that ask for help piece, right? We're not great at
33 years or longer than that, 38 years. I'm 42, right? And so I went way too long before I really started asking for help.
Well, I really appreciate your time on here today, Nick. We'll post any links that you have that you want us to share in the show notes. Oh, yeah. Also, if you've gained any value out of this, Nick Sotelo happens to have his own podcast, The Upgraded Life. There's an episode on there where you'll hear a voice similar to mine and my wife's. You'll get to actually hear her on there.
Absolutely. But
yeah, Nick's got a great podcast. I've been following along with that one as well. So if you guys have a chance, look up The Upgraded Life with Nick Sotelo and check him out. And I'll try and make sure I put that in the, get links to that in the show notes and everything. So it's real easy to find.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, now that you've made it to the end, do me a favor. Go back to iTunes, look up The Upgraded Life with Nick Sotelo, and follow that one. Subscribe to it. Leave him a rating and review. You won't regret it. While you're there, make sure you leave us a rating and review as well. 5-star reviews really help the show get found. Also, if you have a story that you would like to have highlighted on our show, please contact us at fostercareuj@gmail.com. We'd love to hear stories that are inspiring and help others. So be sure and reach out to us if you have something that you think you'd like to share, or if you know anyone who would. You can also find Nick on Instagram at The Upgraded Life as well. We look forward to talking to you guys again next week, and as always,